Hey everybody, welcome to Stratosphere Lounge. I'm your host, Bill Whittle, and it's for some number of you, that number would be, for 58 of you, it's about 10 after 6 Pacific time on the 23rd of January 2020. Still no jetpacks. I'm monitoring the situation. Good to be here. Good to see everybody, and going to spend a lot more time on questions tonight. I know every time I talk about doing a short show, I end up doing a record show, but I'm not really going to be able to do that tonight. I've been working like crazy. I was up till about 3 or 4, I guess, in the morning, finishing up episode 10 of the Cold War, which opens in a couple days. They're going to do the trailer, which is going to be my interview with Mr. Robinson, and then about 5 minutes of the first episode, and then next Friday, a week from tomorrow, the thing begins in earnest. So after all of the work and time that's been in there, I'm looking forward to getting your comments on it. And as usual, just before we start, I'm going to got a lot of stuff we'll talk about. I'm sure we get into questions. I found something that I was looking for, which is always nice when that happens. And I was quiet. Can I be heard? No. Maybe that's better. The particular section I'm dealing with now, or just finished this morning about 2, 3 o'clock, I guess, in this very chair, I decided to call Welcome to the Suck. Now, a lot of people who know a little bit about Vietnam, people saying turn up the sound. I'll give you a little more sound here. Want some more sound here? Let's try that. It's a term that was, was pretty widespread in Vietnam. You get off the plane and, they say, hey, welcome to the suck. But I started thinking about it. I thought the suck certainly didn't end in Vietnam. It sucked pretty bad after that for a while, too. So I tried to decide what the bookends were for that period of suckage. And I came up with August 2nd, 1964 until November 2nd, 1980. And the first person who can identify those bookends wins nothing. But one of the things I went looking for was one of the things that I'd known was just kind of peak suck. And that was rules of engagement for the conflict in Vietnam. So let's see. I actually found somebody. The web is amazing. If you're patient, you know what to look for. And I found it. I found an archive of the actual rules of engagement. Yes, Reagan's introduction ended the suck. Correct. It wasn't the USS Pueblo, however. Dave Big Booty, who misses one for a very. That's shocking. I'm going to have to fall down and clutch my pearls. Dave Big Booty missed one. That's almost incredible. Still waiting. We'll see what was the beginning, the actual official beginning of this suck. Got to pick it somewhere. Where is what I'm looking for here? Yes, Pueblo was. We were well into the suck by then. Let's see. Oh, it's not a rerun of last week. So there you go, and it's PJ Reed and Piper Inva tie. Yes, right across the wire. It's the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. The U.S. involvement in Dave Big Booty comes back for the bronze. U.S. involvement in Vietnam, like so much else about Vietnam, is very, very hard to pin down. So when did the war actually start for us? Well, Eisenhower had advisors there. Kennedy took them from like 900 to, I want to say, about 18,000, something like that. I have the numbers. But then it wasn't really until the Gulf of Tonkin and the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that things really took off. Mobile Mondo says I blame Kennedy. There's a lot of blame to go around. I give this some thought because I haven't really thought much about this era, and I came to the conclusion that the suck was due completely to the interaction of the personalities between Robert McNamara and Lyndon Johnson. When McNamara was Defense Secretary under Kennedy, he was actually, he had a bunch of good ideas. He didn't want the job, or at least he said he didn't in the beginning. He was a former Ford executive, and Kennedy talked him into it. McNamara said he wanted, the right of, approval for everybody in the Defense Department. But McNamara was Kennedy's defense secretary pretty much for the entire administration, and he didn't go completely nuts. But by the time Johnson took over, my theory is that since McNamara and Kennedy both were golden boys, they were both good-looking, young, handsome guys, way ahead of the curve. McNamara graduated Berkeley with honors and went Phi Beta Kappa. Then he went to Harvard Business School, was at Harvard Business School for at least a year or two while Jack Kennedy was there. And so I don't think that Jack Kennedy had much of an inferiority complex when it comes to Robert McNamara. McNamara was really brilliant, but I don't think Kennedy was much intimidated by anybody, at least in terms of, let's just say, as I say in the episode, that of all the presidents we have had in this country, I think you can rate John Kennedy at the bottom of those who have an inferiority complex. So, but Johnson was not a Harvard guy, and he wasn't Berkeley. McNamara was born in San Francisco. Kennedy was born in Brookline, outside of Boston. And Lyndon Johnson was born in Stonewall, Texas. And my theory is not that Johnson was a pushover, on the contrary, but Johnson, as I was working through this in my head trying to figure out what I thought was going on, it looked like McNamara's kind of, maneuvering Johnson into doing what he's doing. But I think it was actually, in reflection, it was the other way around. Johnson had this guy who he knew was brilliant, and Johnson believed him because McNamara believed himself. There are some things about this I didn't know, and this is what this entire Cold War story has been for me. I know there's a period of time I want to cover, and I think I'm just going to cover it more or less evenly, and then I find something really interesting like the Azorian or something. By the way, I just finished rendering that missing Stratosphere Lounge. I'll put it up tonight as soon as I'm done with this. And it's just like, I want to go there. But here's what's interesting about this that I did not know. I don't know if you guys knew this. Did you know that McNamara had a number of troops that he would submit to Johnson? We need this many to prevent a collapse. We need this many to regain the initiative. We need this many for victory. Did anybody know? I didn't know this at the time. Did anybody know that McNamara had a computer model? That he was using a computer model for this? That it was kind of like the climate thing all over again, that he'd built this train set, and the model said, well, if you put in this many guys, this will be the result. He basically tried to run the war like a business manager. We'll have more efficiency if we have the Air Force and the Navy sharing the same fighter jet. Well, that's fine, but the Air Force and the Navy have completely different needs from a fighter jet. If you've got a jet that can get off the deck of a carrier, it can only carry so much ordnance, 300, 400 feet for the catapults. If you got 10,000 feet of runway, you can carry a lot more stuff. But that heavier jet can't land on a carrier, so, boom. And he didn't see it. And it's the same thing with the M16. He just absolutely mandated it. He decided that the M16 was the rifle of the future, and so he simply said, this is going to be the rifle. And he did that. I loved the M16, and I have its linear descendants, but that first one was really, really trouble in the field, really trouble. There's a Marine who had an interview in Time Magazine '69. Says he went out on a patrol. Went out with 72 men, came back with 18, and he said the thing that killed most of them was their own weapons. He said they went back to the battle after they got ambushed, and they'd find scores of guys kind of huddling behind trees or below logs or something with their M16s disassembled, trying to clean the rifle. And the M14 was a great rifle. Everybody loved the M14. And so it's not that the M16 wasn't a good rifle, and it's not that the M16, not that it wasn't the right decision, but the way it was implemented, it's just nuts. It's just nuts. He did the same thing for the TFX program for the next generation fighter at the time. He ended up with the F-111 flying bus, and then, you know, didn't put a gun on it, and didn't put any guns on the F-4s because guns were a thing of the past. We have Sparrow missiles now, radar-guided Sparrow missiles, and we have first-generation Sidewinders. And I knew those missiles had problems too, but I didn't have this kind of problem. After it was all over and people started doing some tallying, turns out that the Sidewinders used in Vietnam, the first-generation Sidewinders, had a PK percentage of kill of 15%. 15% of the missiles of the Sidewinders fired actually hit their targets. And for the AIM Sparrow, it was 7%. Now, the Phantom could carry 4 missiles integral to the bottom of the airplane. It's really kind of cool. I remember building those at 1/72nd scale Phantoms, those cool little slots for the onboard Sparrows. But if you gave it 4 Sparrows and let's say you put another 4 2-on-2 pylons each, that's 8. And with a PK of 8%, you've got a pretty strong chance that you could launch every one of those 8 missiles, assuming you survive long enough, and not hit anything. And this is the kind of this to me is why that era was the suck. It wasn't because the war was tough, and it wasn't because of any of those things. It was just because you just were absolutely confident that the people who were in charge of the thing had no idea what they were doing, and you would be right. McNamara said, this is the Secretary of Defense right after the Cuban Missile Crisis. He said, this is pretty much a direct quote, he said, "There's no such thing as strategy, there's only crisis management." Well, that's it's quite a statement from the Secretary of Defense, you know? There's no such thing as strategy, there's only crisis management. Look at how they fought the first half of Vietnam, and that's exactly how they fought it. But anyway, the whole reason I got kind of launched on the idea of this whole idea being kind of like this general suck was because I'd known that the rules of engagement in Vietnam were just absurd, and they were, but it wasn't until I actually got a hold of them that I realized how unbelievably insane we were in the mid-60s, right up until Reagan came along. I'll give you a couple. So, as I said, Robert McNamara is using a computer, and he's entering data, which is going to tell him how many guys we have to kill, our guys, and their guys. How many do we have to kill in order to win? And that's why they had this obsession with the body count, because it was data. And McNamara being a system, 1960 was the time when efficiency experts and data analysis and market research and testing, all this stuff was just starting in American business. And McNamara was a cutting-edge executive. He brought all of this to the Defense Department. And so he fought a very efficient Wall Street kind of war. It just was a catastrophe. And you get a guy who's looking at numbers coming out of a computer, and he's not realizing that these numbers are people. I mean, he really wasn't. He if you told him he wasn't, he said, "Of course I'm aware they're people," but he really wasn't, because the entire concept of it is so repulsive. And he just said, well, if we send 40,000 guys, we can stabilize. If we send 100,000, we can regain the initiative, and 160,000, we win. Okay, see, it's right here. I've got all the numbers. Crazy. Anyway, I'll just read you some of these because they really do boggle the mind. This is from Vietnam Veterans for Factual History blog, and I'm gonna quote verbatim here. So the rules of engagement I have listed here were the rules of engagement for the ground war and the rules of engagement for the air war. When you hear the ones for the ground war, you would say there's no way anything could be worse than that, but it turns out there could be. These are the actual rules of engagement for the ground troops in Vietnam. I may skip one or two here. Commanders in direct contact with the enemy in inhabited areas could only authorize direct fire, meaning you could see the target, if their mission was in jeopardy and the enemy was positively identified, and then only for defensive purposes. Indirect fire could only be utilized after approval of the province chief, which was a Vietnam civilian, and the province where the fire would be directed. No artillery could be fired in areas where friendly troops were not operating without the prior use of leaflets or loudspeakers, even if enemy fire was being received from the area. Direct fire against enemy forces that were not in direct contact in inhabited areas required approval of both the province chief and the battalion commander. So if you want to call in some artillery because you've got walked into an ambush, your request goes on the radio, goes through all the different nets, finally gets up to the battalion commander, and he hands it off to a civilian who may or may not have been a member of the VC, and they decide, over a table, figure out where this place is and what's the danger and so on and damage. And then, once you're on a committee like that, you got to say no every now and then because otherwise there's no reason for you to be there. And back down it went, but of course by then everybody's dead. Indirect fire missions in inhabited areas. That means if there anybody there, meaning you're not on a test range essentially. Indirect fire missions in inhabited areas required the approval of the province chief, the battalion commander, and the dropping of leaflets or the use of loudspeakers to warn civilians prior to commencement. Before we can put artillery down to defend our guys, we got to get some airplanes over there and drop some leaflets. And by the way, they have to drop the leaflets before they can drop the bombs. U.S. attacks in inhabited areas required that the U.S. commander explain to the inhabitants why the action was initiated after the attack was over. This one is this one to me is the pick of the litter. Fleeing enemy troops could not be engaged unless they were first ordered to halt and failed to obey. Then they must be fired upon with the intent to wound only by firing at the lower extremities. I ended up saying, countless people have said that we fought the Vietnam War with one hand tied behind our back. But what I came up with was, a better way to think of it is we fought the Vietnam War with one hand tied behind our back, and when we started winning with only one hand, we tied the other hand. That's basically what we did. Those are the ground rules. Now, because when one guy bolts, and by the way, for those of you not up on this, whenever you have an engagement and one side breaks and just runs for it, almost all of the casualties that are totally taken is on the retreat. If it's a rout, there's no more dangerous time. It's been this way since they had sharp sticks. That the huge casualties come when the enemy cavalry rides down your fleeing infantry. And so if you ever get the jump on these guys and you actually have a chance to make some progress, nope, can't do it. Air war, this is even better. Here we go. So there's an approved target list, and there were entire boxes that you could not attack. But let's just walk through these. Why don't we? Here's what the rules of engagement were for air crews. Hanoi, the enemy capital, and Haiphong, the enemy's primary port, had a 30-mile perimeter that were no bombing zones. You could not attack the enemy capital or the enemy primary port out to a 30-mile radius ever. Ever. And that meant you had to fly over Haiphong on the way to Hanoi, and you got to look down and see the Soviet trawlers unloading the SAMs. These guys coming in from the Yankee Station, Navy guys saw it all the time. They saw them unloading the SAMs, and they had to fly over those guys. And then they went to Hanoi, where they got shot down. Rail yards and switching stations, where you would assemble supplies or troops for a mass attack. Rail yards and switching stations were off limits. Enemy airfields were off limits. MiGs could only be shot at if they were airborne. Couldn't shoot them on the ground because you can't go near the airfield. You could only shoot at a MiG if they were airborne, clearly identified, and displayed hostile intent. Now think about that. In order for the guys who don't have guns on their jets to use their beyond visual range missiles, which have an 8% kill rate for that longer range Sparrow, in order for them to employ this essentially worthless weapon, the only advantage, and McNamara said so, was we don't need guns because they're never going to get close enough to guns. We're going to shoot them down over the horizon beyond visual range. Well, that's the theory. So you've got pilots in these airplanes who don't have guns, and their only defense is to shoot down enemy planes beyond visual range, but the rules of engagement say that they cannot open fire until they visually identify the target as an enemy airplane, and those MiGs that are coming up from airfields in North Vietnam that we cannot go bomb have to show hostile intent before we can attack them. We can see red stars on the wings. And they can be moving into attack position, but as far as the rules of engagement were concerned, you could not engage those aircraft unless they opened fire or did something to demonstrate hostile intent. Of course, by the time you were close enough to see the red stars on the wings, not only are you inside the range of your Sparrows, and the Sidewinders are not terribly efficient once they get off the rails, and they're hard to lock, these early Sidewinders. So now you've got a bunch of guys in a big fat jet with no guns, and these Vietnamese are coming up in MiG-19s, MiG-21s, and having their way. Oh, this is nice. I'm not making this up. SAM sites, probably lost more aircraft to SAMs than anything else. Surface-to-air missile sites could only be attacked if they attacked first. In other words, even if we're not in those 30-mile exclusion zones, and even if they're not in one of these protected areas, if we fly down and we see a SAM site on the ground, we cannot attack that SAM site until it launches one of our guys. Also, it simply boggles the mind. SAM sites and anti-aircraft sites could not be attacked while they were under construction. Locks, dams, and dikes could never be attacked. Hydroelectric plants could not be attacked. Military targets could not be attacked if they were in the protected zones. Trucks in Laos and North Vietnam, think about this, on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or anywhere, enemy trucks that were in Laos or Vietnam could not be attacked unless they were on a road and displayed hostile intent. How does a truck display hostile intent? So even though you could see them, they had to be on a road, and if they're on a road and they're going south, unless they send you a strongly worded message over the radio or something, how are you going to determine they have hostile intent? And this is the one. I don't know why. This is not the major one, but it just, to me, it's military truck parks more than 200 meters from a road could not be attacked. In other words, I could have all of my trucks lined up, and as long as I was 205 meters away from a road, those trucks are off limits. Now, some of this obviously was, like, for instance, the 30-mile exclusion around Hanoi and Haiphong. That was designed to make sure that the Soviets who were loading those missiles didn't get hurt. And this is the thing that the whole Cold War, looking back on it, just completely amazes me about. We were so far ahead of the Soviets in virtually every category, but we were so terrified that if we had killed Soviet technicians who were unloading the missiles that were killing our guys, that suddenly the Soviets would start popping H-bombs over it. It just, I guess when the stakes are that high, your appraisal of risk just becomes nuts. But this is how we fought the first half of the war, and that was the suck. And I think that the Nixon came in. It took him a little while, but he started using different tactics. Stockdale, great hero, was the ranking officer in the Hanoi Hilton and the prisoner of war camp in Hanoi proper. We talk about how they would be beaten, they'd be tortured, they'd have their teeth knocked in, they'd be starved, they'd be kept in isolation for months. All of this stuff, have to sit in their own filth, all of it. And this was going on the entire time that Stockton was there, and he was there for years and years and years. And then Nixon decided to bomb Hanoi in 72, I think it was. And the day after the bombing, Stockton said the streets of Hanoi were absolutely quiet. And he said, and the guards were so obsequious. They offered us food, they were kind, they were polite, they used respectful language. All of this happened overnight because in the war that we'd been fighting for 8 or 10 years, we finally decided to, bomb the enemy capital. And overnight, these guys who'd been just beating Americans to death in some cases, all of a sudden, they're like real nice. Real nice. What do you say about that? I mean, it's just, you hear these people talking about this as if there's no evidence. It's like, well, my opinion is that if you bomb people, you're just going to make them more angry. How are you going to make them more angry? And that's ultimately it, The example I finally came up with, and this is it, we'll go back to questions. But the example, I try to find an analogy because Johnson would pick targets in the White House Situation Room down below. He would have a board. Now remember, it's middle of the day there, so it's middle of the night here. So any kind of response had to be picked. Johnson said those boys couldn't bomb an outhouse without my approval. He was right. Literally correct, not just figuratively. He was literally correct. So Johnson's got pins on maps in the basement of the White House in Washington, D.C., and for all intents and purposes, I never did find out what the exact time difference is. It's not important. But essentially, if it's midnight in Washington, it's noon in Vietnam and vice versa. So when the president finally has time to go down to his little train set down there and start moving his pins, you're usually anywhere from 6 hours, maybe at least 8 hours behind whatever happened last. And then the message has to get downstream. By the way, I really had problems believing this, and I had to back it up, and apparently it's true. The layers of red tape we had to go through in Laos. In Afghanistan or Iraq, if you put in a call for close air support or artillery support, when we're on our game, 15-minute wait is kind of a long time. But in Laos, fire missions were not approved in 15 minutes. Fire missions did not occur in 15 minutes after the call, and they didn't occur 15 hours after the call. The response time for a fire mission in Laos averaged 15 days. 15 days. Between the time a guy gets on a radio and says they're gunning us down here and the artillery opens fire. I'm going to think that if you're under heavy enemy contact and your artillery doesn't show up for 15 days, at that point, it's probably not going to be one of those better late than never cases. What do you say to this, So anyway, I was just trying to figure out how Johnson would do this. He'd bomb them, and then he'd stop bombing them. We're not going to attack here. We're going to keep Hanoi. We're not going to attack Hanoi. We're not going to attack your harbors. We're not going to attack the trail. We're not going to do all of these conditions. And it's like, why? Are we trying to show him how nice we are? Is that it? While we're napalming his country? Is that it? What is it you're trying to achieve? And I couldn't figure out what this looked like. And the only thing I could come up with is I said that Lyndon Johnson fought the Vietnam War like a man who was trying to pet a feral cat. That's exactly it. He'd walk forward, the cat would walk back. He'd walk back, the cat would walk forward. He'd put something down on the table, on the sidewalk, and then step back a little bit, and the cat would come forward, and that was encouraging. So he'd go back to try to pet the cat, and then the cat would run back again. So he said, okay, I need some more food. So he put something else back down, step back again. This kind of thing. This kind of teasing this thing out to pet the cat. And it's like, anyway, yeah, it was not so much fun. So it started to turn around with Nixon, and the next one's called The Liberators, and I can talk about Operation Bolo, and I can talk about Creighton Abrams, who, like Ridgway in Korea, came in and just completely changed the situation. They just brought him in too late. By the time Ridgway was given operational theater command, we were already basically prohibited by law from having U.S. troops in contact because Abrams said, "I'm just going to go up the. We have tanks, we're the United States, we're Americans, we got tanks, and we have air cover." So I say instead of going out and taking this hill, killing some guys, getting our guys killed, counting the bodies, sending that information back to Washington, helicoptering out, letting them retake the hill and taking the hill again and getting more guys killed so we can run up the body count of ours and theirs. But as long as we kill 200 and only 100 guys of ours are killed, then we're winning the war. Ridgway said, no, we have strengthened conventional weapons, so we're going to just take armored division. We're going to march up the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Anybody who decides to mess with us, we're going to knock them out of their lights out from the sky, and we're not going to stop until the tanks are in the center of Hanoi. And then we'll dictate victory conditions and their surrender conditions. And it would have worked, too. He actually tried to do it with ARVN troops, but that late in the war, their morale was so bad that he just came too late. But there were liberators on the way. And Robin Olds and Bolo was an amazing thing. But the suck continued after Vietnam. In my opinion, peak suck period for this country was when the democratically controlled Congress voted to cut off aid to South Vietnam unilaterally after we had promised them that if they took over the burden in Vietnamization, we would replace whatever they spent. We promised them. That was peak suck. 1974. Arab oil embargo. I remember waiting in line. Yeah, Dave Big Booty's got it right. Oh, yeah, we were in a war of attrition against Asia. I think peak suck was that moment when they pulled the rug out from underneath them. So we had to wait for gas, and then Carter's elected, and I remember everybody thought, oh, he's so authentic and so genuine, He walked his inauguration route. He didn't ride because he's a man of the people, And so even the dignity of that ceremony is kind of eliminated. And there are Americans waiting in line for fuel, 4-hour wait to get gas in this country. And just come out of Vietnam, felt utterly helpless. Had a friend who joined Air Force, was combat controller, joined in 78 or 79. He said morale was just unbelievable. Then the hostage situation in Iran, and then Desert One, where we go and try to rescue them. I remember very well. I was 20 years old. I remember waking up and hearing about Desert One and the catastrophe that we were on a mission to go and free these hostages, and helicopters had collided in the desert because so much sand was being kicked up, and we didn't know anything about flying in desert conditions, apparently. But here's the thing. I was 20 years old, and when I heard that we lost those helicopters, but we were on a mission to get our guys out, I was so proud. I wasn't proud of losing the helicopters. I was just proud that after all of this time, finally, we were trying to do something. So Carter's sending them Bibles, and he's sending them cakes, and he's kissing Brezhnev, in the Russian style, and that'll solve the problem. And then along comes Reagan, and an hour before he's inaugurated, the hostages are released. It's just sheer coincidence, obviously. Oh, boy. Well, sir, I don't like it. Anyway, that was the suck. So that's what I've been working on for the last week. It gets better now. 2 to go, and then I'm done.